This is a Patton. This is also a Patton. And this behind me is a Patton II. Literally, as in it's the second tank called Patton. But was it two just a stopgap like that Patton? Was it one Patton too many? Well, today we hope to find out.
During the first weeks of August, the perimeter line was assaulted again and again by the enemy, who had boasted he would push the UN forces into the sea. But the line held.
As with the first Patton, the need for the M47 was born out of the turmoil of the Korean War. Modern American tanks were in short supply, and while the M46 had done well enough as a stopgap in Asia, there was a genuine concern that should the war expand to Europe and pit the Soviet bloc against NATO, modern Soviet tanks would outclass even the M46, which, as we've discussed in a previous video, was already considered outdated. Even when the M46 was being developed from the M26 Pershing, the tank, which would become the M47, was already on the drawing board. It started as a total redesign, the T-42 medium tank, designed to remove all traces of the M26's DNA that some criticized even in the M46. It was this T-42 that was originally recommended for production, but some in the Army Field Forces worried that, like the old Pershing, this experimental tank would prove to be underpowered. Further testing was needed, but there just wasn't any time.
A sudden, unforeseen factor changes the entire course of the war. Chinese communist troops cross the Manchurian border and help the North Korean Reds drive back UN forces. Chinese communists fighting in Korea are estimated at 75,000, with another 500,000 across the border in Manchuria posing a more serious threat.
While Korea did create anxieties, it also had proven that the M46 Patton's new transmission and engine solved the problems of maneuverability and power. Meanwhile, the T-42's armament and fire control system showed promise on the proving grounds. The solution, it seemed, was simple. Use the old 46 chassis and the new T-42 turret and combine them to create another stopgap tank. In fact, it would be the stopgap to replace a stopgap. So in November of 1950, this combination tank would be given the designation 90mm gun tank M47, even though it wasn't yet standardized. This is a unique moment in American tank development, but it was done so the vehicle could be ordered early and produced as quickly as possible in June of 1951. Standardization was expected to quickly follow, so to prevent confusion, M47 it was, or more specifically, the Patton II. The nice thing about having both an M47 Patton II and an M46 Patton I here in the museum's collection and here today in the restoration shop is that we can compare them both visually. Both of these tanks share a lot of the same DNA and therefore a lot of the same stuff. Some of the most important components, though, that have remained the same between these two vehicles is the engine and the transmission. This big hunk of metal is what we call the CD850 series transmission. If we're being technical, it's a CD850-5. Now, the transmission that was in the original M46, the Patton I, was pretty much the same as this one, although it was the CD850-3. That transmission was combined to the massive 12-cylinder Continental-built gasoline engine called the AV-1790-5A engine. But this M46 behind me isn't just an M46, it's actually an M46A1. So that means it has an improved engine and it has an improved transmission. In the case of the engine, it's now the 5B instead of the 5A, and the transmission is a 4 instead of a 3. So yeah, if we're generalizing, the M47 here shares the exact same engine and transmission as the M46. But if you really want to impress the maybe 12 people who actually know what an M47 actually is, well, then you can tell them that it has the same engine and transmission as the M46A1 Patton. But here's something that our M47 probably should have, but it's actually missing. And it's not really a fault of the tank, it's more so just how the design changed over time. If you look down here behind our larger bogey wheel, you'll see that there's a small mount there that's been plated over. That is the mount for what we would call the track tension idler. It's a smaller wheel that would stick out here and push down on the track. Now our M46 has one, and the M47 should technically have one too. But at some point after these vehicles exited the production line, a lot of them saw their track tension idlers removed. It was found to be a redundant part. Today, the museum owns 3 M47s to my knowledge, and 2 of them are missing their idlers, whereas one of them still has its training wheels. Of course, the changes to the M47 are mostly obvious. That T-42 turret behind me has a really unique silhouette with the longer rear bustle and the ears on either side of it, which indicate where the new fire control system sits. That basically means the scope for the cannon. I especially like the triangular gun mantlet, kind of unique to this vehicle, even if it does look a little bit like a codpiece. Now, the T-42 turret is actually so much bigger than the M46 turret at the base that the turret ring had to be increased to fit the thing onto the old chassis. Of course, beyond the turret, there are always more subtle changes. For example, the number of track return rollers on the vehicle was reduced from 5 to 3 after testing in the summer of 1951. Yes, I know our M46 doesn't have 5 return rollers either, but if you want the reason for that, go and watch the M46 video. Anyway, the list of removals was also extended to the controls. Unlike the M46, which has full controls for both the driver's position and the bow gunner position, the M47 returns the bow gunner's position to the lowly duty of just firing the machine gun. But I guess that's okay, because after the M47, the military concluded that the bow gunner was such a redundant position that they just removed him altogether. That makes the M47 the last United States tank that actually had a bow gunner. Speaking of the bow, if you look at this vehicle, you notice that the M47 has actually changed the slope of its front plate to 60 degrees, which is far steeper than its predecessor. That actually improves armor protection, and more importantly, replicates the front plate of the T-42. So we didn't lose that improved protection by actually switching to the older M46 hull. However, it leads, in my opinion, to the greatest sin of the M47. We removed the air conditioner. Technically, it's called a rotocone blower, but now, instead of being between the driver and bow gunner and giving the front plate of the vehicle a unique bump, those greedy dudes back in the turret get to hog all of the fresh air. The blower has been moved now to the rear of the turret bustle that I talked about earlier. Let's go back to that turret for just a second. Remember that bit of testing I mentioned, which removed the controls and the return rollers? Well, more importantly, the same test identified a whole suite of initial problems with the turret itself. Originally, the T-42 was going to mount a mechanical stabilizer to keep the gun from bouncing as it moved down the road, which was manufactured initially by IBM, the computer company. However, for the sake of beginning production in the summer of 1950, remember this whole tank is kind of a rush job, the stabilizer had been removed. So none of the turret parts had actually been tested without the stabilizer being installed, and therefore by the end of the summer of 1951, 15 separate changes were recommended before the M47 was ready to be given over to the troops. These included changes to the power traverse, that is, left and right, and the elevation systems, up and down, on the cannon to prevent lag in the turret. With all the similarities and changes worked out, the M47 Patton II, or Patton 47, or 90mm gun tank M47, depends on who and when you asked, was standardized in April of 1952. By the time production of this tank was halted in November of 1953, over 8,570 Pattons had been produced. By that time, the Patton, though, was being overshadowed by yet another Patton, the M48, at the time still the T48, and the need for this stopgap had passed.
The interior of the M47's turret is about as spacious as the M46 before it, which is to say that there's basically no space at all, unless you like getting intimate with this 90mm cannon. But the M46 used a 90mm M3A1 cannon. The M47 changes it up a bit. This is the same caliber of weapon, but it is a new type of cannon. This one initially was called the T119. Here in the 47, though, we have the T119E1, later standardized as the 90mm cannon M36. Ours is pretty easy to identify, at least physically, from the outside of the tank because it has this late production T-shaped muzzle brake. Notice I say late production because early production M36 90s like this one would actually have more of a cylindrical shaped muzzle brake. And we have that on some of our other M47s in the museum's collection. Now this T119E1 had a higher muzzle velocity than that original M3A190 that I talked about in the M46 video. That gave this gun a bit more penetrating power, but the E1 designation also meant that this gun could actually use the ammunition for that older M3A1 90mm alongside the newer ammunition designed for use in this cannon. Speaking of ammunition, here in the turret we have 11 positions for what we would call our ready rounds of ammunition, those easily accessible in the turret, and then beneath that there are actually 60 more rounds that would be stowed underneath the turret, which makes them sometimes difficult to get to depending on the position the turret is sitting in. So that gives the M47 in total 71 rounds of ammunition, which is a whole 1 round more than the M46 before it, which doesn't really make all that much of a difference. But beyond this 90mm gun and all the other auxiliary equipment here in this turret, of course, the one thing that really sticks out is what's running ear to ear here, as it were, in our turret, the stereoscopic rangefinder. This is the M47's fire control system, or, for those of you who don't know, simply the scope for the gun. But you might be asking, why do we need all this? How does it work, and what does it do? Unlike previous American tanks, we don't just have a single telescope for rangefinding. This binocular eyepiece actually performs an important function, taking two images and combining them to trick your brain. Just like a pair of 3D glasses, the rangefinder takes two separate images seen at slightly different angles. As you look through the sight, your brain subconsciously combines them to create an image that appears to have depth. To really get an explanation as to why this is important, we can consult the field manual for the M47. When you look through the scope, there is this V shape in the upper center of the sight called the ranging reticle. As the manual states, quote, "The range knob is rotated to increase range. This ranging reticle will appear to move away from the gunner," end quote. Basically, the top of the V stays near you, but once the bottom reaches the target, the proper range has been sighted. All this is possible without complex electronics due to the optical illusion provided by the stereoscopic effect. In other words, you didn't notice it, but your brain did. For those who don't know tanks, you might think that this data is so complicated it couldn't possibly link with the gun here. But in fact, it's the exact opposite. They are 100% linked. Almost every American tank up until this point, the M47, whether it's a Sherman or a Pershing, they all have what we call a coaxial sight, which means that as the gun elevates and depresses, say I was the gunner here and I'm moving the weapon up or down using my joysticks here, the gun will move and this scope actually moves along with it on the exterior of the vehicle. So that way, no matter where my gun is pointing, the scope has automatically followed it. And it's all done using analog technology, which is pretty cool.
So M47 production ends in November of 1953. This is mere months after the end of the Korean War. While the M47 never saw combat there, and never would with America for that matter, its story was far from over. The M47 suddenly saw itself thrust into a variety of testing programs, some of which were intended to improve the existing design, while others sought to test technology for future main battle tanks. These various programs ranged anywhere from logical upgrades to one particular example that seems almost like science fiction. But let's start with a few of the E variants, or experimental variants. Shout out to the British here and all the Centurion fans that I've seen in the comments. The first experimental M47 in early 1952 added the gun stabilizer ripped right out of the Centurion tank, creating the M47 E1 variant. This configuration showed a lot of promise, but was never fully produced as the M47 production was winding down anyway. Shortly following the E1 in the summer of 1954 was the M47 E2 variant, which changed how the ammunition was stored. Remember, in the turret, retrieving the 90mm rounds from underneath was occasionally difficult. So to ease the access to rounds and increase the total amount of rounds that the M47 could carry, the military axed the bow gunner entirely and replaced his position with an ammunition rack. The upper hatch over the bow gunner position in this variant was at one point proposed to fit two 30-caliber machine guns lying next to each other, but that was never adopted. In the end, the couple E2s made were more of a proof of concept. The M47 was obviously out of production in 1954, but if an emergency presented itself and/or the existing fleet had to be upgraded, the M47 E2 was admittedly a very promising design. Of course, the award for weirdest American upgrade was the proposal from the Yuba Manufacturing Company to actually shove a steam engine into main battle tanks. This was in the early 60s. As you can imagine, the Army reviewed it, and amazingly, while the proposed engine may have actually given more power than many contemporaries, implementing a steam-powered system would be too expensive and too hard to maintain. While the M47 was the tank chosen to have the steam system installed, no prototype was ever constructed, which is a real shame, because could you imagine steam-powered tanks in Vietnam? That would have been awesome. Admittedly, the M47 never did see combat with American forces, despite a rush to give it to our units in Germany during the Korean War. As the Cold War ground on, however, America decided that as it produced better tanks, the M47 would be better suited as an export to NATO allies and many, many others from around the world. Most of these countries fall under the NATO umbrella, and at the time the M47 rolled off the assembly lines, some were still reeling from the economic turmoil of World War II. But like in that war, where the American Lend-Lease program proved so useful in arming allies, here in the 50s, America would once again serve as the world's arms dealer. The M47, of course, was a part of the numerous policies that saw these countries bordering the Iron Curtain properly armed to resist a Soviet invasion. It would be the first modern tank utilized by West Germany, for example, and also it was the first modern tank arriving in places like Belgium, France, and Austria. While many may call this tank a stopgap, and rightly so, it's important to note here that this wasn't the case from the US government's perspective. The M47 wasn't just expected to hold the line until a replacement was found. It was genuinely intended to serve in open war with the Soviets, and that intent was present from the drawing board onwards. As a result, the M47 was, for a brief time, an important factor in the theoretical NATO defense of Western Europe, a scenario that, thank God, never came to pass. A few other highlights here include Italy, who ended up owning 30% of all 47s ever made. Yugoslavia is also a funny one, as despite being communist for a time, the country still managed to nab some M47s through America's Military Assistance Program, or MDAP. The M47's service in European countries also warranted some foreign attempts to improve the basic designs, which was obviously ridiculous. The French, for example, managed to squeeze a 105mm gun into the turret and replaced the 90mm entirely to increase firepower, which is kind of cool. Italy, and eventually Pakistan, would decrease the M47's ravenous fuel consumption by switching the gasoline engine to a diesel one manufactured by MTU, a German company, and I will not try to pronounce its full name. The water-cooled engine ran at 750 net horsepower, which is a bit better than the 704 net horsepower of the Continental engine, which is originally in the vehicle. Not to be outdone, all of these international attempts to improve the M47 led the Americans to re-examine the tank in 1968, over a decade since production had halted. The initiative was simple: take as many parts from the new M60A1 and adapt them for the M47 to simplify possible future parts production and logistics. The pilot tank for this series of new variants, christened the M47-M, was completed in 1969. It included the M60's larger diesel engine, top deck, and grille doors. The last set of return rollers were moved towards the rear, and the track tension idler was totally removed, like I spoke about earlier. The bow gunner position was eliminated, and another ammo rack was added, much like the old M47E2 variant from the years before. Finally, to help with fire control, a hydraulic gun control system from Cadillac Gauge Company was also installed. This variant proved to be very well liked, and as a result, from 1972 to 1974, 400 M47s were converted to the M47M. Of those, 147 ended up going to Pakistan, but the conversion also occurred in all the M47s destined for another place, the Kingdom of Iran. Before the Iranian Revolution of 1978, Iran was once America's ally of convenience. Because of Soviet influence to the north, Iran during the 70s was gifted massive amounts of American-made equipment, among others. Amongst these shipments of vehicles were M47 tanks. As I said before, the M47 never had a combat history with the United States, but on the battlefields of Africa and in the Middle East, the M47 ironically got to test its mettle in the hands of US allies, sometimes turned pariahs. One of the most overlooked conflicts in recent history is, in my opinion, the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. If you dig into the history of this often forgotten war, it is so interesting to see not only how it paved the way for future strife in the Middle East, but also how foreign influence shaped the way it was fought. But this is a video about the M47. How did it fit into this conflict? When Iraq suddenly invaded Iran in 1980, the Iranians found themselves basically alone against the world. Still partially rebuilding from the revolution, the only military technology the Iranians had left over was surplus from the 70s. The M47, alongside American Phantom jets and even older British vehicles, now rolled into battle to halt the invasion. But the Iraqi armored spearhead was led by modern Iraqi T-62 and T-72 tanks, which of course had been gifted to them by the Soviets. The M47 was obviously a generation behind. As you may imagine, I wasn't exactly able to find combat reports that spoke to the Iranian M47s and their performance, but considering two things. First, that the Iraqi invasion was mainly successful in the early months of the war due to armored columns, and second, that the Iraqi advance was mostly repelled by massed infantry attacks, it's safe to say that the M47 performed poorly against its newer Soviet-built counterparts. Look at this photo, for example, taken in the early 1990s during America's first Gulf War. These M47s, not destroyed but rather abandoned, lay together in a yard full of captured equipment just outside Baghdad. This photograph, in many ways, sums up the combat experience of the M47. It never fought during its prime, which is probably a good thing, considering that would have meant World War III. But when it finally did reach the battlefield, it was out of necessity rather than preference. I've given this Iran-Iraq highlight as an example, though, as to why the M47 here shouldn't just be lost to the sands of time. When people think tanks, they want something that's big, bombastic, and fought in well-known places, and that also has iconic stories. They want something like the movie Fury, not the tank that was usually painted up as a Panzer in minor shots from movies like The Devil's Brigade or The Rat Patrol. But that's exactly why I think it's one of America's most interesting tanks. You see, for every M1 Abrams, every Centurion, and every Leopard 2, you gotta have these in-betweeners like the M47. Vehicles like this can point us to new stories that many of us don't really know, and they can shed insight on why those iconic tanks that we all know and love are the way that they are. That's why this tank, in my opinion, is anything but boring.